I've watched billions of dollars evaporate in a single trading day, but nothing vanishes faster than public trust. Money comes back if you're patient. Credibility never does. That's why when I heard that a lawsuit had landed in Washington with my name buried somewhere inside it, I didn't feel fear. I felt recognition. Because every empire, financial or political, eventually meets the audit it's been postponing. The headlines came fast. MAGA Mike Johnson served with lawsuit as legal bombshell drops. Most people read that as political theater. I read it like a balance sheet. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other, and somewhere in between, truth. Trying to reconcile the difference, the story began with a courier outside the Rayburn building. He wasn't carrying a manifesto or a subpoena for me. He was holding a thick envelope with Johnson's name on it, but I knew from experience that when money and power mix, the ripples never stop where they start. They travel through ledgers, holding companies and partnerships you've never heard of until a lawyer decides you should. That envelope contained more than accusations. It contained exposure. And exposure, I've learned, is the most expensive commodity in Washington. I've paid premiums for risk my whole life, but I never expected someone to calculate the risk of association. They said the complaint referenced a fund, Praxis Holdings LLC, a small, quiet outfit supposedly linked to my wider network of investments. On paper, Berkshire doesn't micromanage every fraction of a venture. We let managers run their plays. But that fund's transactions had a peculiar smell, the kind that doesn't show up in quarterly reports, but drifts through rumor before the auditors arrive. When the news broke, analysts called my office like brokers chasing a margin call. Mr. Buffett, do you have any connection to this? Connection. That word has built and destroyed more reputations than leverage ever did. I told my assistant to issue a statement. No awareness or involvement in the operations referenced. True, technically. But in this business, technical truth is still a cousin of denial. I wasn't defending myself from guilt. I was defending clarity. Because once your name becomes a headline, even silence sounds like strategy. By mid-morning, the markets had already reacted. Berkshire stock dipped less than 1%. But I could feel the vibration like a small tremor before a landslide. Investors weren't panicking about profit. They were questioning purity. They wanted to know whether the man who preached transparency had been caught in someone else's fog. I spent that morning in my office in Omaha staring at the same old portrait of Benjamin Graham. He taught me that every investment is a vote of confidence in someone's character. But Washington had rewritten that rule. Character had become collateral. And MAGA Mike Johnson was suddenly the borrower of last resort. According to the complaint, his team had coordinated with outside groups for strategic message amplification. I know that phrase, it's corporate camouflage. It means the marketing budget and the propaganda budget shook hands in a dark hallway. If those funds flowed through Praxis even indirectly, then my money had brushed against politics without consent. That's like finding counterfeit notes in your own vault. You didn't print them, but you'll still have to answer for them. By noon, television anchors were slicing my quotes from old interviews, trying to turn them into reactions. One clip kept looping me saying it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. They were right to play it, because that sentence wasn't a warning. It was an accounting principle. Reputation is goodwill on the balance sheet of life, an intangible asset until someone files a claim against it. I called my lawyers. They said we had minimal exposure. I've learned that phrase usually precedes maximum regret. Exposure isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in headlines. Meanwhile, Johnson's team went silent. Reporters camped outside his office like day traders waiting for a reversal. But there was no reversal coming, only revelation. The lawsuit had already triggered requests for communication logs and donor records. If history is any guide, documents talk louder than spokesmen. That night, as I walked through the empty halls of Berkshire, I thought about leverage, not financial leverage, the moral kind, the kind that builds influence quietly until it owns you. Johnson had leveraged faith and party loyalty. Now the margin call had arrived. At 10 p.m., Reuters published an internal memo from one of our subsidiaries confirming a small stake in Praxis Holdings. Insignificant on paper, explosive in print. That's how contagion starts. one footnote that redefines a narrative. The next morning, my phone lit up with messages from friends in Congress and CEOs I'd known for decades. None asked if the story was true. They asked if I was okay. That's how you know the market has priced in doubt. I told them what I tell every young investor: worrying doesn't change outcomes, information does. But even as I said it, I realized I was the one waiting for information this time. That's the cruel symmetry of transparency. You spend a lifetime demanding it from others. Then one day it demands you. By dawn, financial networks were running with a new phrase, the Buffett effect. They said my involvement, however tangential, had stabilized markets before. Now it was destabilizing politics. Funny thing about influence, it compounds interest faster than capital ever will. And when it reverses, the losses are exponential. At breakfast, I opened the Wall Street Journal and saw my own face above the fold beside Johnson. Two men who'd never shared a stage now shared suspicion. He had ideology, I had integrity, and both were suddenly up for audit. That's when I realized something deeper was shifting. This lawsuit wasn't just about campaign finance. It was about the quiet merger of money and narrative. The idea that you could buy conviction the same way you buy common stock. Johnson had turned belief into an asset class, and the market was crashing. So I did what I always do when I smell fear. I studied the complaint line by line, like an earnings report. And somewhere around paragraph 42, I found the sentence that changed everything. Funds may have been routed without explicit authorization. That phrase is the linguistic twin of the check is in the mail. It buys time, but not forgiveness. I leaned back in my chair and thought, somewhere someone decided that plausible deniability was worth more than truth. Maybe they were right for a quarter or two, but truth has the longest compound rate in existence. You can't outpace it forever. The markets would open in an hour. Investors would watch tickers. Journalists would watch me. I could release another statement, hire more lawyers, tighten the distance between my name and Johnson's, but that wouldn't stop the tide. Because the tide doesn't ask for permission, it just arrives. And when it goes out, everyone sees who's been swimming naked. When the market opened that morning, I didn't turn on CNBC. I never do when my own name is trending. Noise is the enemy of judgment, and judgment is the currency you spend when truth comes calling. But I could feel the pulse of panic through secondhand reports, brokers texting me mid-trade, analysts tweeting half-truths, funds shorting Berkshire on speculation. That's how confidence collapses. Not in one thunderclap, but in whispers that grow legs. Still, I wasn't afraid of the lawsuit. I was afraid of the story it wanted to tell. Because in America, the courtroom is no longer where truth is found. It's where truth is performed, and everyone is a shareholder in the drama. By mid-morning, one of my attorneys, an old friend from New York, flew to Omaha. He walked into my office, loosened his tie, and said, "Warren, they're not after money. They're after precedent." That word sat in the air like smoke. Precedent. It's the invisible ink that rewrites the rules for everyone who comes after. He explained that the lawsuit's architects weren't interested in proving corruption. They wanted to blur the line between political funding and private capital so completely that every future donor would think twice before writing a check. A deterrent through spectacle. A warning disguised as justice. I listened quietly, as I always do. Silence is undervalued in negotiation. It forces the other side to fill it with information. He kept talking, describing filings, strategy, optics, but my mind drifted back to a simpler time, the 1950s, when I'd sit in Ben Graham's lectures at Columbia. He'd talk about intrinsic value, margin of safety, discipline. Everything was math then. Numbers didn't lie. People did. Now, decades later, I realized that politics had become a market without fundamentals. Everything traded on sentiment, not earning. A headline could short a career faster than any bear raid. And MAGA Mike Johnson, whether guilty or not, had become the meme stock of morality. I didn't envy him, but I also didn't absolve him, because anyone who weaponizes faith or nationalism for gain is playing with leverage that doesn't show up on paper. And sooner or later, the margin call comes. That afternoon, a reporter from the Financial Times called me. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic. Miss Buffett, off the record, do you believe the system is corrupt? I paused. I've learned that any answer shorter than a paragraph will be misquoted. So I said, corruption isn't the disease. It's the symptom of a system that rewards illusion. If we valued honesty as much as performance, corruption would starve. He didn't print that part, of course. They never do. Nuance doesn't sell ads. By evening, Johnson finally made a public statement. He stood behind a podium, flags behind him, and said the words everyone expected: baseless, politically motivated. I will fight this. I've heard that speech before from CEOs, governors, even athletes. The tone is always the same, part defiance, part rehearsed disbelief, but the eyes give it away. You can't fake the weight of truth pressing on your conscience. Later that night, I called one of my oldest partners, Charlie's protege. He'd been tracking online chatter, algorithmic shifts, sentiment analysis. He told me something chilling. Warren, AI news aggregators have tied your name to Johnson 6,400 times in the past 12 hours. The longer it loops, the more permanent the association becomes. That's when it hit me. We'd entered the era of algorithmic guilt. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to be searchable. Once data made the connection, humans followed.
And redemption no longer mattered if the feed decided otherwise. I poured myself a cherry Coke and sat by the window. Outside, Omaha slept quietly. It's a city built on real things: steel, grain, hard work. No lobbyists, no noise. Just people trying to balance their own ledgers. But even here, I could feel the invisible network of speculation humming through every screen. Reality had become a derivative product, traded, leveraged, and resold by people who'd never touched it. The next morning, my general counsel briefed me on something unexpected. A whistleblower had come forward, an accountant from Praxis Holdings, claiming the fund had processed bundled contributions through a series of shell entities. The sums weren't large, but the pattern was unmistakable. A feedback loop between political consultants and private equity interests. Someone had turned influence into an ETF. I leaned forward and said, "Show me the paper trail." He slid a thin folder across my desk. No dramatic revelations, just transactions. That's how corruption hides. Not behind big numbers, but in small, consistent ones that look too ordinary to question. Every line item was dated, signed, approved, and somewhere in that spreadsheet was my signature, automated, standard procedure, authorized months earlier, a tiny rubber stamp of trust that someone else had misused. I closed the folder. I wasn't angry. Anger is unproductive emotion. I reserve it for when I run out of logic. Instead, I felt something colder: clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see the hidden cost of delegation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about all the young investors who idolize me, who watch my interviews for wisdom. They see patience compounding, optimism. They don't see the doubt, the compromises, the blind spots you accumulate over decades of scaling responsibility. Power doesn't corrupt instantly. It corrodes slowly, like rust under perfect paint. And now that rust was visible. At 3 a.m. I sat in my study and wrote a note to myself: find the truth before they do, then decide if it's survivable. I've made a career out of predicting risk, but this wasn't risk, it was reckoning. The lawsuit wasn't my trial, but it was my test. Could I defend my reputation without defending deception? Could I protect Berkshire without protecting shadows? By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I called my PR head and said, prepare a statement. Full cooperation. No spin. He hesitated, then asked, are you sure, sir? I said yes. Because if you try to hide smoke, people will look for fire. If you show them the match, they'll stop looking. He didn't understand it immediately, but he would. Markets forgive mistakes. They never forgive manipulation. That day, as the lawsuit entered discovery, I knew the next chapter wouldn't be written by lawyers or journalists.
It would be written by perception. And perception, once lost, trades at a permanent discount. The following week, Washington turned into a theater. Every network had its own headline. Every pundit their own prophecy. Some said the lawsuit would dissolve quietly. Others said it could redefine campaign finance forever. They all agreed on one thing: my name gave it weight. It's a strange thing, realizing that credibility, something you build grain by grain, can be weaponized by someone else. The very reputation that once opened doors for me was now being used to pry open closets I hadn't even walked into. Reporters began circling Omaha. They wanted interviews, statements, reactions. One of them even stood outside my house with a camera crew, narrating live as if a confession might come out of the front door. I didn't step outside. There's no negotiating with noise. Instead, I spent those days reading not legal briefs or market reports. History. I went back to the Gilded Age, to J.P. Morgan and Carnegie, the titans who built fortunes and then spent their twilight years trying to justify them. They too believed money could be moral if used wisely. But history never writes morality. It writes irony. I saw the pattern repeating. Back then, railroads connected America. Now algorithms do. And once again, wealth had become confused with wisdom. The same arrogance, the same blindness, the same belief that intentions could clean the fingerprints of power. The irony wasn't lost on me. For decades, I'd been preaching about integrity, value, patience. But maybe integrity is just another currency, valuable until inflation of ego makes it worthless. Around the third day, the whistleblower's affidavit was leaked. Not officially, of course. Nothing in Washington leaks officially. But once it's out, it's permanent. The document confirmed that Praxis Holdings had indeed routed small sums through affiliated messaging organizations. One of those entities had connections to Johnson's PAC. The dollar amounts were trivial, but the optics were radioactive. The media called it the Praxis Path, a catchy name for a messy truth. And right there on page 11 was my automated approval stamp. No intent, no knowledge, just process. But in politics, process is never innocent. When I saw it, I didn't flinch. I've lived too long to mistake shock for substance. But something inside me shifted like a quiet ledger, finally reconciling itself. I'd built a life teaching others to think long-term, to avoid shortcuts. But here was proof that even the most disciplined system can become corrupted by the convenience of trust. I called my board that evening. We held a video call, faces small and tired on the screen. I told them the truth. I said, if any of our subsidiaries touched politics, even unintentionally, we own that mistake. We don't bury it. One of the directors interrupted me. Warren, this isn't your fault. You didn't authorize it. I smiled faintly. In leadership, I said, everything is your fault. That's what leadership is. Accepting liability for other people's decisions. Silence. Then someone said, so what do we do? I replied, we tell the truth before someone else sells their version of it. The next day, we issued a statement, not crafted by lawyers, not polished by PR, plain, direct, and uncomfortable. It admitted procedural failures. It acknowledged that an internal investigation was underway. It didn't assign blame. It accepted responsibility. The markets didn't crash. In fact, Berkshire's shares rose 0.5%.
Investors don't flee from mistakes, they flee from lies. But Washington didn't calm down. The lawsuit grew teeth. Johnson's team started deflecting blame outward, hinting at elite financial manipulation. That phrase made me laugh. Not because it wasn't absurd, but because it was predictable. When people run out of facts, they manufacture enemies. A friend in Congress called me later that week. He said, Warren, turning this into a narrative about you funding both sides. I said, in truth, I fund only one side, the side that's solvent. He didn't laugh. Politics lost its sense of humor long ago. Then came the subpoena. Not directly to me, but to my holding entities, a formal request for transaction records and communication logs. The lawyers called it routine. There's nothing routine about having your entire professional life archived for suspicion. Still, I cooperated. I always do, because resistance implies concealment,
and transparency is the only hedge that never depreciates. But cooperation doesn't erase implication. The public doesn't read filings. They read headlines. And the headlines were relentless. Buffett connection deepens. Johnson allies quietly funded through Shadow LLC. America's most trusted investor caught in political web, each title more dramatic than the last. Each one adding another zero to the cost of perception. That weekend, I drove out to my old home in Dundee, the same neighborhood where I started investing at 11 years old, the same streets where I delivered newspapers before sunrise. Everything looked smaller now, but the lessons felt larger than ever. I thought about my first real investment, 3 shares of City Service Preferred. I bought too early and sold too soon. That mistake taught me patience. Now 70 years later, the market was teaching me humility. We live in a time where truth doesn't need to be false to be weaponized. It just needs to be incomplete. And incomplete truth spreads faster than any lie. I sat on that porch and asked myself something uncomfortable. Had I helped build the very system now turning against me? By normalizing efficiency, automation, scale, had I made trust impersonal? Had I turned values into transactions? Maybe that's how corruption sneaks in, not through greed, but through delegation. Because when you trust systems more than people, you stop noticing when the system starts lying for you. That night, I wrote another note in my journal. The real risk isn't losing money, it's losing meaning. I used to believe capital was neutral. Now I'm not so sure. Capital carries the fingerprints of its owners, and those fingerprints stain everything they touch. So when I saw my own fingerprints on a machine that had helped distort democracy even indirectly, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't criminal, but it was corrosive. And corrosion left unchecked doesn't stop at one corner of the empire. It spreads. By the 3rd week, the lawsuit had become more than news. It was entertainment. Late-night hosts joked about it. Podcast hosts dissected it. Influencers who couldn't read a balance sheet suddenly became experts on finance and morality. It was no longer about what happened. It was about what people felt happened. And that's when I understood something new. In the age of constant noise, truth doesn't lose to lies. It loses to volume. I'd seen it in markets before. During every crash, rational analysis is drowned out by panic. During every rally, logic is silenced by greed. And now politics had adopted the same pattern. A perpetual trading floor of outrage. They say reputation is built over a lifetime and destroyed in a headline. But they're wrong.
Reputation isn't destroyed, it's auctioned. Piece by piece, click by click, until there's nothing left but the memory of credibility. One evening I walked into my office long after everyone had left. The lights of Omaha stretched out in silence, and the building felt like a monument to all the things I used to believe in. Hard work, patience, compound interest, quiet integrity. I sat down and pulled up the latest market reports, but I couldn't focus on the numbers anymore. For the first time in my life, they felt meaningless. I'd spent decades trying to make sense of markets, and suddenly I realized I'd been watching the wrong market all along. The real market was human attention, and it had no fundamentals, no margin of safety, no discipline, just volatility dressed up as democracy. A few days later, I was called to testify. It wasn't a trial, just a deposition. But the ritual was familiar: a long wooden table, microphones, lawyers shuffling papers like traders moving inventory. They asked polite but loaded questions. They wanted to know if I'd ever discussed political contributions with any member of Congress. I hadn't. They wanted to know if I'd ever profited from political decisions. I hadn't, at least not directly. But when you own as much of America as I do, direct becomes a technical term. Every answer felt like a transaction. Honesty traded for context, clarity exchanged for brevity. And I knew that when the transcripts went public, no one would read the full paragraphs. They'd read the pull quotes. They always do. Afterward, one of the junior lawyers thanked me for my candor. I smiled, but I didn't respond. Candor isn't virtue, it's just what's left when denial stops working. That night, I took a long drive through the outskirts of Omaha. The highways were quiet, the fields empty. I thought about Charlie. He'd have laughed at all this. He would have said, Warren, this is what happens when reality gets traded like a stock. Sooner or later, someone sells it short. He was right, as usual. The next morning, I met with the board one last time. The internal review was complete. No illegal activity, no intentional misconduct, just procedural negligence, the kind of thing that fills thousands of pages of compliance manuals and still slips through the cracks. I signed off on the report and told them release it publicly, every word. A few members hesitated. They were afraid transparency might invite more scrutiny, but I said scrutiny is the cost of trust. If you can't afford that, you're already bankrupt. The press didn't react with outrage. They reacted with boredom. The story lost its fire once the truth became less exciting than the rumor. That's how scandals end, not with justice, but with fatigue. And yet, even after the noise faded, something inside me didn't. I kept thinking about the whistleblower, about the small transactions, the unseen hand. I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious. What kind of world had we built where corruption didn't need villains, just automation and apathy? I realized then that capitalism's greatest illusion isn't greed, it's detachment. The belief that if the system is efficient enough, morality becomes optional, but morality doesn't scale. It has to be carried person to person, like trust-heavy, inconvenient, and irreplaceable. One night, months later, I went back to the office where this all began. The city was asleep. I poured another cherry Coke and opened my journal. The page was blank, waiting. I wrote the market rewards efficiency, but life rewards conscience. The two compound differently. Then I closed the book. I'd been called many things, investor, capitalist, oracle. But if I've learned anything from this storm, it's that no amount of wealth can hedge against the erosion of meaning. When you reach my age, you stop asking how much money you've made. You start asking how much truth you can still afford. The lawsuit eventually dissolved into paperwork and memory. Johnson survived politically, though diminished. The headlines moved on. The country found new scandals to consume, new enemies to hate. That's the rhythm now. Perpetual distraction as a substitute for progress. As for me, I still invest. But I read fewer earnings reports and more history. Because history, unlike markets, doesn't pretend to be rational. And sometimes when young analysts visit me, eager to learn the secret of success, I tell them the same thing every time: never confuse wealth with wisdom. One can vanish in a bad quarter. The other only disappears when you stop looking for it. They nod politely, but I can see it in their eyes. They don't understand yet. Maybe they never will. You can't teach perspective. You have to survive it. The world will keep spinning. The markets will rise and fall. Politicians will play the same games with new names. And somewhere in the background, another lawsuit will make another man think he's the center of the storm. But truth isn't a verdict. It's a mirror. And most people spend their entire lives running from their reflection. I'm done running. Let the market judge me. It always does. Eventually,